We live in times where happiness is sold as a product, an idealized lifestyle where everything works perfectly, where there is no pain, no frustration, no uncomfortable silence. From an early age, we are taught to chase this ideal as if it were a natural promise of existence. Advertisements, social media, movies, and optimism gurus all reinforce the same idea. If you try hard enough, if you're disciplined, if you think positively, one day you'll be fully happy. But what if that promise is an illusion? What if the very idea of full happiness is, as Schopenhauer once said, a trap engineered by our insatiable desires? In this video, we will dive into the thought of one of the most brutal and honest philosophers on the human condition. Schopenhauer did not offer easy consolation. He forces us to face what we prefer to ignore, the tragic structure of existence. Yet by doing so, he may paradoxically offer us the only real form of freedom, lucidity. From birth, we are shaped by an invisible narrative. It tells us there is a place we must reach, a state of stable, permanent happiness that will validate our entire existence. This narrative is passed on subtly but relentlessly in the perfect smile of a celebrity, the idealized couple in a commercial, the professional success goals that promise the long-dreamed-of fulfillment. The trap is subtle because it doesn't look like a trap. It just seems like common sense. After all, who doesn't want to be happy? But Schopenhauer warns us what we call happiness is, in reality, merely the temporary absence of pain. It's not a positive state, but an interval, like the silence between two notes in a sad song. He writes, "True and positive happiness is impossible. The most we can hope for is a relatively bearable existence." That statement may sound grim, but think for a moment. How many times have you intensely desired something, a trip, a relationship, an achievement, and upon reaching it, the satisfaction faded in just a few days? What seemed like the peak of happiness turned out to be merely a new starting point for another desire, and the cycle began again. Happiness, as we conceive it, is a mirage in the desert. The more we chase it, the further away it seems. Schopenhauer unmasks this cruel logic and invites us to see life without the filters of modern advertising. He invites us to stop running. But what lies behind this relentless chase? To understand why we'll never be happy in the way we imagine, we must grasp the most central and devastating concept in Schopenhauer's philosophy, the will. This is not rational, conscious will, the one we use to decide what to eat or what to wear. The will he speaks of is much deeper, unconscious, impersonal, a vital force pulsing through everything that lives, a blind, irrational energy that simply wants to continue existing. It desires for the sake of desiring, moves for the sake of moving. Schopenhauer writes, "The will is in itself a blind and incessant force, devoid of knowledge, but it drives the entire universe." According to him, this will manifests in us as a constant, never-satisfied desire. What we call the self is, in fact, just the individualized appearance of this universal will. That's why we suffer, because we are dominated by a force that always wants more. When we achieve something, a new desire immediately arises, and the sequence never ends. This realization is brutal, but it reveals a truth we all silently intuit. There is something within us that is never satisfied, even when we have everything. This will, being blind, does not seek a greater good. It has no higher purpose. It just wants to keep asserting itself. Whether in the pursuit of pleasure, status, power, or love, It is what drags us from cradle to grave. And here lies the irony. The same will that animates us is responsible for our suffering. We are driven by it, and thus condemned to endless wanting. In Schopenhauer's words, life swings like a pendulum between suffering and boredom. If we lack what we want, we suffer. If we get it, we are bored. And then we want again. In this context, the promise of happiness is not just an illusion, it is a mechanism of the will itself to keep us in motion. It never intends to fulfill itself. Happiness is the bait. Desire is the hook, and we are the fish. The promise of happiness is one of the most persuasive narratives the human mind has ever constructed. But Schopenhauer dismantles this promise by revealing the hidden mechanism behind it, the endless cycle of desire. For him, to desire is to suffer, and paradoxically, to stop desiring is to fall into boredom, another form of suffering. The logic is cruel. We want something. While we don't have it, we feel the pain of absence. When we get it, we feel brief relief that quickly turns into emptiness. And then we want again. This repetition forms what Schopenhauer called the wheel of torment. Nothing we achieve remains a source of lasting satisfaction. Joy is fleeting. Pain is constant. He writes, "The life of man, from beginning to end, is an uninterrupted series of desires whose satisfactions are only temporary and whose frustrations are inevitable." This idea is not just philosophical, it's visceral. Think of the times you believed something external would solve your inner anguish. A new love, a bigger house, an ideal body, a professional achievement. And when you finally got there, what happened? A few days of euphoria, followed by silence. That silence, which should be peace, becomes restlessness, and the mind begins to search for the next goal, the next reason to keep desiring, the next reason to feel alive. This is where Schopenhauer is at his harshest and perhaps his truest. He claims that pain is not an accident of life. Pain is the structure of life. So what remains for us if desire imprisons us and full happiness is a mirage? Is there any way out? Next, we'll explore what Schopenhauer himself saw as a path to liberation, the power of suffering as a tool of awareness, and the silent role of art, contemplation, and detachment. In a world driven by the illusion of constant pleasure, Schopenhauer's philosophy feels like a punch to the stomach. But strangely, it's also an invitation to liberation, not through hedonism, but through awareness, not through acquisition, but through renunciation. Unlike other philosophers who saw reason as the path to salvation, Schopenhauer believed that suffering is what rips us out of illusion. Pain, instead of being an obstacle to wisdom, is what opens our eyes to the true nature of existence. He states, "Suffering is what reveals the true value of life. It's when we lose something, when we are deeply frustrated, when we face the pain of loss, of loneliness, of failure, that we have the chance to awaken. Pain shatters the fantasy of idealized happiness and returns us to what is real." But Schopenhauer doesn't stop there. He points to paths of relief, not salvation, but temporary suspension of the will's tyranny. The main one is art. In a profound aesthetic experience, when listening to a piece of music that moves us, when contemplating a work of art that stirs us, when we lose track of time in the presence of beauty, we stop being slaves to desire, even if only for a few moments. Time halts, the will falls silent, and for a moment we become pure consciousness. He writes, "Art pulls us out of the current of willing and places us for a moment in pure knowing. Beyond art, Schopenhauer points to other paths: the contemplation of nature, the practice of compassion, and even the voluntary denial of desire. An idea he aligns with Eastern asceticism like Buddhism. In these practices, we do not seek happiness, but relief from the will's tyranny. That relief is not euphoria. It is peace, the temporary end of restlessness, and perhaps that is where true freedom lies, not in the frenzied pursuit of more, but in the lucid acceptance of less. Here lies the central point, perhaps the most uncomfortable and also the most liberating idea in all of Schopenhauer's philosophy. Full, continuous happiness as we imagine it simply does not exist. And the more we chase it as a fixed state, the deeper we sink into frustration. But this is not the end. It is, in fact, the beginning of a more lucid life. The error is not in wanting to be happy. The error is in believing that happiness will come from the fulfillment of all our desires, as if it were possible to build a castle of permanent satisfaction on the sand of time, impermanence, and death. Schopenhauer invites us to do the opposite of what the modern world preaches. Instead of running after more stimuli, more achievements, more dopamine, he invites us to withdraw, to a more contemplative life, less driven by the urge for pleasure and more attuned to the silence of consciousness. The fewer desires a man has, the closer he is to happiness. For him, freedom does not lie in conquering everything. It lies in wanting less. It lies in stepping out of the game rather than winning it. It may sound radical, but perhaps there's nothing more sensible. Because as long as we pursue happiness as an obligation, we will live as slaves to dissatisfaction. But when we recognize that desire is never fully fulfilled, we gain the chance to free ourselves from its tyranny. This does not make us apathetic people. On the contrary, it makes us more present, less deluded, more serene. People who live not for the promise of a future paradise, but for the lucidity of a real moment. Schopenhauer's philosophy is not a self-help manual. It is, rather, a brutal mirror that forces us to face what we prefer to ignore. But it's precisely for that reason that it holds transformative power. By accepting that life does not owe us happiness, we can finally stop demanding so much from it and from ourselves.